Hello everyone, today we talk about the Oghuz Turks. This video is conceived as an army organization one, albeit about these people we really know a few, mostly from later sources that objectively are, pretty reliable as at least, given the broader context of the time and spaces involved. And therefore I believe it's important to give a kind of a simple historical background to understand better what these peoples were in terms of political identity, the enemies they fought against, what influence they spread, and the Oghuz were a really important polity here, emerging, as we'll see after the Second Turkic Empire, in a moment in history where lots of things were changing. That point, surely these peoples were involved in a change proper. It's also very fascinating to observe the ultimate end of these populations, the fact that the Seljuks fundamentally descend from the Oghuz Turks, and also part of their Universalism, as far as the one of the steppe was involved, was surely an important ingredient, let's say, in the recipe of the eventual Seljuk Empire. Because although here we're looking obviously at Indo-European influence, and especially the one of the great cultural centers in the area, especially the Persian ones, these were peoples that also were bordering with, with the Ghaznavids, that at some point the Seljuks come to, to even dominate the Khwarezmians. So all populations that also were in between, fundamentally, the frontier between the great steppes, the oceanic steppes in a way, and the other universal empires of the sedentary world. And this influence is fascinating because, especially towards the early period, we don't have much of a clarity even about the exact dynamics of the migrations of these peoples. They basically arrived from the east, from the core lands of the the Turkic steppes, in settling this area fundamentally east of it's basically today's Kazakhstan in part, and beyond also, because they didn't stop there, but east of the Caspian Sea, and maintaining an important, these were large people, as we will see now. They contained tens of hordes, and at some point were even said to have been more powerful than the same Pechenegs, and also because they gave origins to the Seljuks, as we're saying, which is something that has naturally an important meaning in the development of the Middle East, where you realize the continuity of in these waves of steppes conquerors that arrived fundamentally. It's always the same old story. These penetrate in important advanced areas, right? The most permeable was definitely Persia, because it was in between, between a sedentary and nomadic society. It was essentially a feudal world where there was probably no centralized power, and the oligarchies could play with this new dynasties arriving, maintaining power, but at the end of the day, absorbing them, right? And then other dynasties would come, and that's a kind of a vicious game, but at the same time it has an impact, also because the Iranian plateau state, on the verge of, of the, instead, the way reach are more sedentarized, more urbanized lands of the Caliphate and so on. Much of the spread of the Ghulams since an early age seems to have been connected to, even to the arrival westwards of the Oghuz, we'll see now, among other peoples, and therefore what you notice in here is the continuity in the instability that naturally is proper of the steppe, right? But in part encompasses since ever. You can imagine, since the Scythian invasions of Mesopotamia, right? This broader area of the Middle, and also the Near East, as the Oghuz, as we'll see, will be also dispersed by the Seljuks in other areas, albeit maintaining this ideal of the political unity of the universal power that this big empire had back in the day in the steppe. There would be a lot to add here, also because from a strictly historical point of view, it's fascinating to look at all the hints rather than the actual certainties that we have about these dynamics. There are also naturally conflicting theories. Like, we don't even know what they actually, what they were properly called, like where the etymologies of their name came from and so on. But let's say, let's make it simple, stay simple. Maybe at some point we'll study this better. So the Oghuz, also there are different ways to call them. They were called Al-Quds, or Ghuz if you prefer, from the Arabs, from the Persians, right? And the Byzantines called them Uzoi, Torki by the Russians, also Tork or Uz, right? So these are all the names that we sometimes get. Mostly we actually have actually runic inscriptions from the heartland of Asia that seem to have been talking about them, right? This essentially federation of 9 hordes, right? And called in fact the Turks Oghuz, right? And we have even Chinese sources listing the actual names together with Turkic sources. Actually, these tales, the nine tribes formed these people that seemingly originated in the 7th century. Think about what the 7th century steppe was like. And whichever the reason was still framed within the broader instability of this world. The idea is that they were rebelling or maybe exploiting simply the collapse of the West Turkic Empire, right? So we just know about the westward movement that came to encompass certain areas, also, for example, the North Aral Sea, where they also pushed away other peoples. For example, the Pechenegs are in part, partly moving. Some of them actually remain. We know from 11th century Muslim authors that among the Oghuz Turks there were also some Passionate tribes that could be an evidence of that. So it's never there was this specific people we can't trace the boundaries of. No, in the steppes there's no such. It's just a matter of political cohesion, right? Ethnically speaking, there is a dramatic homogeneity, and even among those groups that are actually not properly, they're not Turkic. Here, sometimes if you even think about the Uyghurs, we're talking about wars that arrived up to China at the boundary of Turkic and Mongolic, in a sense. Think even just the linguistic affinities, the political titles such as the Yabgu, the Khan, and even among the Indo-Europeans. Actually, the Oghuz Turks contributed in part to Turkicize the Western steppes that up to that point had been mostly essentially an Indo-European thing, an Iranian thing, and that elements that naturally remained among them, and that are in this sense typical of the steppe. Here, the ethnic identity is properly the political identity. It's what these people stuck to in terms of wherever these groups moved to, they exacted tribute from, and we'll see in fact that it had far-reaching interactions, right, also with the West. So elements of this federation began moving towards the West in the 9th century, or even before, actually. Certain dates give the mid-8th century, arriving up to the mid-11th. Maybe it's too extended, right? Because by the time we were actually already dispersed, in part. Also consider that these populations naturally didn't migrate all in one block, so there were even within them some different waves. And the fact that we're talking about Turks Oghuz, right? 9 hordes. That tells you how it was typically, different polities actually acting together, but sometimes also on their own. And naturally, this westward movement comes to impact the more sedentarized areas, right? Actually, in the steppes there are sedentary areas too, but the broader our historical knowledge of these populations mostly comes through what the centers of writing, and the sedentary civilizations were fundamentally registering about these peoples that were big, right? Speaking of their also the ambiguities of their name, from the late 10th century, this were the Oghuz also began their decline, the name Turkoman was applied to some parts of this nation, and eventually to also what remained of them broadly meant. And probably not even at the time it was a clear understanding, right, of exactly from what was true from these historical sources. That's where we find this kind of more general definitions, but more of their disgregation later. So speaking of, this attempt of their political military hierarchy that was fundamentally all one, right? These were warlike peoples. They literally spent their life on horseback, and as you can imagine, I don't know whether we'll talk about kind of a typical Oghuz cavalryman at some point in the type of soldiers videos, but there is a dramatic homogeneity at some point. We'll probably also make something more, something broader. Let's put it in this way. There is a significant difference. In one hand, normally these peoples were ruled by a Khan, right? But there was a second in command was usually sometimes the prince, or simply the second most powerful ruler the next heir, or simply the most powerful ruler, perhaps also the brother of the Khan, that had this title of Yabgu, right? And normally the Khan had the overlordship on the people in these confederacies. It seems that the Oghuz, however, were actually ruled by a Yabgu. That is, that this happens in certain Turkic realities where the power of it's like the major dome among the Franks, I don't know, or the sultan for the caliph, right? It naturally speaks for a kind of a articulation, diversification of power that in case of the Oghuz can derive from the extension of their power, that from the western from east of the Caucasus stretched up to the Balkhash Lake in the east, and naturally had very intense contacts also with the more kind of sedentarized, for their own standards, peoples in the south, where they would tend to gravitate around. It's fascinating that probably the very, I don't think there is a specific proof of this, but some of the very first Oghuz may have, interacted with those heirs. Naturally, were pouring even in the forms of war bands, right, and not in larger people. At the time where the Sassanids still existed, right, we have evidence of the Sassanids, for example, deploying elephants in the first line to cope, to scare the horses of these Turkic populations of the steppes. And you can imagine, even in terms of, of course, the nomads has this predatory mindset for which they had to extend their grip over the rich, more populated, more agricultural lands. But at the same time, it would motivate from these worlds properly a universalistic mindset that, as we were saying before, in the case of the Oghuz, also played an important part for their identity. Naturally, the steppes, the Turkic Mongolic peoples knew this idea of the oceanic leaders, right? This the equivalent of the universal power. Not the Khans, but the Khagans, right? So the emperors of emperors, fundamentally. Here it's an era in development, right? It's a culture in development. It's also a military system in development. And this articulation of power with those various officers, the Yabgu, various leaders, let's say, honest, the Yabgu, the Kudarkin, and even a properly military commander-in-chief is fascinating. We know that by the 11th century, so in a time which they weren't faring dramatically well anymore, the Oghuz appear to have consisted of 24 hordes, which is a freaking lot still for the time. And their military strength is recorded as greater than that of the Pechenegs that we were saying before. So think about what they could be at the beginning. I think there is no concrete demographic, substantiability of the manpower of these peoples, but given the same size of number of hordes and the area they settled, and also the defeats they accomplished. In alliance with the Russian Prince Sviatoslav of Kiev, the Oghuz attacked the Khazar capital Itil in 965. They contributed actually to the collapse of the Khazars. Also, we know of the specific Oghuz mercenaries naturally taking service pretty much everywhere, including among the Khazars, but at that point, even as kind of entire tribes sometimes at a time, the destruction of Itil is this event after which the Khazar Khaganate never recovered, right? So there was also permeability now of the spaces from other groups. The Russian Oghuz alliance continued when they attacked the Volga Bulgars 20 years later, right? And however, and this is a bit of a more Western side perspective, we know, and that's because of the aforementioned reasons, that naturally the sedentary areas were better documented. We know from some sources that after heavy defeats in Russia itself, vaguely meant, in the mid-11th century, this tremendous number, naturally the sources exaggerate, we're talking about 600,000, yes, of Oghuz survivors invaded the Balkans in 1064 to escape. Naturally, 600,000 is a ridiculous statement. They might have been no more than some tens of thousands, but even if they had been so, they would have been too much in force, right, for a refugee people escaping from defeat. There were less, but still important numbers, because by the 11th century, even several thousands of people are a big deal demographically speaking. And in 1066, they were still 65. Excuse me. They were still dangerous, in fact, for the local communities, and they gained an initial success against the Roman Empire, after which, however, were decimated by plague and famine, and were defeated jointly by the Pechenegs and the Bulgarians. And the Romans then settled many of the survivors as military colonists in Macedonia, which naturally speaks for what normally the Byzantines did in terms of strengthening the frontier with warlike peoples that were just at the end of the day as nomads like these, searching for settlement in an agricultural land in somewhere they could, however, had their pastors, but gradually also settling the area and sheltering the empire from attacks of similar peoples, like here, including the Pechenegs, right? The Bulgarians at this time had actually already been, the Bulgars had fully been absorbed within the overwhelmingly Slavic population. But what did actually happen to the Oghuz to essentially begin this diaspora being scattered in the feet and so on? Well, there is the major question is mostly, as always in these areas, the continual pressure that kept arriving from the core lands of these Turkic populations that were, in those places more warlike, less sedentary, so they were always pushing on frontiers. So the Oghuz Confederation was gradually weakened by the intensification of the Kimek-Kipchak pressure from the north and northeast, right? And the last Oghuz Yabgo Shah Malik died in 1042. Consider this time the Oghuz were already converted to Islam, which is something that, however, happened very late in time. In fact, towards the time of their disintegration, and it was just like and this is from the side of the Yabgo, right? Not so the majority of people remained overwhelmingly pagan, as there was no reason for a nomadic society to change practically. So yes, this major waves from the northeast contributed to weaken their consistency, but there is also to say that, especially in the southeast, there were new changes that had originated by the detachment of a part of the same Oghuz in the lands of the Samanids and in the Ghaznavids and Karkanids, right? So substantially, the Samanid state collapsed towards the end of the 10th century, and a branch of the Oghuz from which the semi-legendary leader Seljuk, right? So the founder of the Seljuk dynasty, right, and his sons eventually marched there, and fundamentally began also to crush the Ghaznavid and Karkanid rule. Now, what is fascinating, we'll talk about the Karkanid or Karakanid in a while, because it's actually, they seem to have been a branch of the Oghuz too, right? There were lots of peoples actually stemming from the Oghuz, right? But even part of the Pechenegs, some trace even contacts with the Uyghurs, because yes, we were saying they were all together. Saying Ghaznavids, as you know, were also originally a Turkic dynasty that settled in Persia, so they also shared naturally a lot. But the especially the Ghaznavids' lands were the ones where the Seljuks would start mostly to build their power from, and to actually have a detrimental impact on the same Oghuz Confederation, right? The Seljuks basically began to demolish it on their own, right? Because they were already crumbling, but the Seljuks thought it better to accelerate this process and to distribute them among Anatolia, the Near East, Mesopotamia, where they actually would contribute what we call the Seljuks, right? The Seljuk Empire, right? You know, many of these peoples were actually Oghuz tribes, were settled by the same Seljuk dynasty that was becoming, you know, ever more Persified at this time, to be scattered in this other lands, right? Somewhat peripheral, also in part. So the Oghuz, yes, are to be found pretty much everywhere in the area. They had always been selling their services around as mercenaries, as we were saying before. The Ghulams, also in the Caliphate, began to increase exactly at the moments of the migrations of these peoples towards the west, and naturally, even among the Ghulams, there was a great variety between those who were actual slaves, like defeated, enslaved, purchased, enlisted, and those who actually instead joined as freemen fundamentally, but were still in this. We often call it slavery, but in the Muslim mentality, it's kind of and also in the practice of it, it's kind of in between you know, sort of serfdom that is also meant in terms of, you know, the master has some responsibility towards the serf that has, with a markedly military character, that these people's coming from, you know, this wild, ferocious lands of the steppe that was in continuous turmoil, naturally had all the quality to embody. So yes, we can say that many of them settled also, as we will see, in the Euphrates region. They even kept, I mean, sometimes even as individual tribes, right? They were selling, and as individual tribes, they would keep selling their services, sending their war bands to serve as mercenaries for surrounding people. So that tells you how fragmented the reality, even by the 11th century, the rise of Seljuk power concretely was. Other Oghuz instead remained in the steppes, some in the same places where they were before, others being absorbed, as we were saying before, by the Pechenegs, right? They sometimes appear also as subjects in later Cuman armies, and it seems that the majority of them was finally absorbed by the Karakalpak Federation, the so-called Black Hats, as they were called also by the Russian sources, that, however, have a few to do seemingly with today's Karakalpaks that live in north of the Aral Sea. They're also, you know, risking to be wiped out because of the desiccation of the lake and so on. But we often trace that kind of philological connection, but it's actually not. But they were still important because they gravitated around that area, and the fact that the goods by that time, the Oghuz were absorbed seemingly by that group is meaningful, because it's somewhat the same regions where they already were before, and there were surviving minor tribes that are generally referred to as Turkomans, which is a term that you find even in Western sources that also had a much less I'm talking about Frankish sources during Crusades, much, looser understanding of those movements, especially, north of the Mashraq in the steppe proper. And that, however, also represents, well, more or less how much these peoples had been scattered and blended together, and how fundamentally they were the same thing, right? Speaking of specifically, how could you differentiate them? You see, the term Karakalpak, even if it whether it actually means black hats, it's just, these guys sometimes had just colors or minor symbols to distinguish each other, because in terms of political, social, and military identity, were literally the same exact thing, right? They all flowed in the same identical way. They all had, as you know, as typical steppe people, this core of elite heavy cavalry, right? Elite also numerically speaking. They did these swarms of mostly tributary peoples that fought, that had been stripped of most of their wealth, being usually centered in the hands of the rulers, were all kind of horse archers, sometimes with zero armor, and however delivering a hell of an arrow shower on the enemy. And these are all peoples you find literally everywhere. Essentially, the Turks are this, right? And all the ones that are absorbed by the Byzantines. We made a video about the Roman auxiliaries towards this, like during the High Middle Ages, and you realize, the Byzantines were capable of copying them in practice, in having actual native troops fighting the same style. But sometimes we're talking about literally the same people that swarmed continuously from the Pontic area into, as we've seen also with these remains of the Oghuz that were settled in Macedonia and that were absorbed eventually as Roman subjects. Speaking of the Karakhanids or Karkhanids, these were Oghuz neighbors, and they appear to have been related, since they are sometimes at least referred to as Turkomans, though their armies seem to have been a bit more heterogeneous in nature, right, receiving even elements of Mongol stock on occasion, and also influenced by the Persianate, because they were clearly in contact with the Ghaznavids, from which they seem to have motivated in part at least their military organization by the early 11th century. And we know about the Karkhanids, and this can fit well also for the Oghuz, that the nucleus of their army was this, as we were saying before, a small corps of royal ghulams, something between 500 1,000 strong. Probably the Oghuz had been at least more powerful, and still were, but at least numerically speaking. And this nucleus is recorded in a campaign dating to 1007-1008, right? In an army of 50,000, right? So we're talking literally about one heavy cavalryman over 100 horse archers, ideally, right? Something like, or something less, 1 over 50, if you pick 1,000 as the maximum. That gives a pretty good idea of what these peoples were fundamentally about, and how ferociously, can't say properly stratified, but the society was, but how much the wealth was concentrated in the greater, in this, in the Khan's power. The royal ghulams here mean literally slaves, even in these same Ghaznavid or comparably Oghuz army, right? Because they would have slaves all the time available, and also increasing through them, a bit like in the Caliphate or in other Muslim powers, the detachment of the properly of the emperor's private forces from the rest of the people, which naturally was a very important political move to create an independent power from the rest of these tribes that naturally tended to have, as we've seen, a confederate nature. So the idea that theoretically at the beginning, given the ethnonym of Turks Oghuz, makes you understand, would have not conceived to be ruled by just one group, one tribe, or one dynasty even, but they were all freemen, right? And so in here, from the 7th century to the 11th, naturally a lot of things had changed in terms of, in part sedentarization, in part, drawing resources from the crushed people who've seen the Khazars before. They were pretty big and pretty rich. So the accumulation of wealth in the hands of the elites and the models imported from the neighboring sedentary areas, right? So the creation properly of a system that was not entirely like nomadic at this point. It's something closer to the Middle Eastern type. It's pretty clear, right? It's objectively fascinating because the hardcore of the steppe was far north and east, right? Even in certain archaeological evidence, we see that, these peoples were kind of in a high. I mean, specifically the Ghaznavids are, as we've seen before, but at the same time, we can see it even in the Western Eurasian steppes, in a certain sense. Given that these were fundamentally equestrian peoples. The Seljuks formally conquered the Karkhanids in 1073. So even in here, it's as if they had extended control on a seemingly Oghuz-derived power. The Seljuks were definitely a bit the game changers in the last Oghuz period, right? And they, as we've seen, they were themselves an Oghuz org. Or at least they're recorded as such. They began as mercenaries. This is the story. They had taken, as we've seen, their name from this semi-legendary chieftain called Seljuk, who had initially even hired himself as his followers out to a Khazar prince in a moment in which, as we've seen, the same Oghuz were about to crush the Khazars together with the Rus. So that gives you also even if whether the story is true or not, or we can't speculate, but that still gives a pretty good hint of how fragmented even this same steppes powers really were, so that one group could simply detach itself or simply siding with another power, right? And the Seljuks were employed eventually by the Samanids before they crashed against the Karkhanids, which could also represent anti-Oghuz policy from the side of Seljuks, as the Karkhanids as a branch of the Oghuz themselves. This happened later in the 10th century, and later they were hired by the same Ghaznavids when they actually revolted against them in 1037 and took power. So the Seljuks by the mid-11th century had firmly established themselves in the Euphrates region. But even in there, they kept, hiring themselves out as troops to the Romans, for example. So when we think, eventually, Manzikert in 1071, right? So we're talking in a time where in the same fall of Jerusalem, by the way, in the same year. So imagine how fluid this reality was, right? How we can't pick the Seljuks, right, in thinking that they were kind of a great empire. At the end of the day, it was a freaking mess that surely they controlled partly, but still through bonds that, as we've seen, they even used part of the same Oghuz tribes to settle in certain more peripheral areas in the west to eventually do the dirty job. Because actually, when we made a video on Manzikert, it's a 2 hours and a half video on the battle, and that tells you how both the Romans and the Seljuks were fundamentally outstretched at their respectively at their what did I say first, Romans or Seljuks, saying this way, eastern and western limits in Manzikert, right? They were actually campaigning in Syria, as you know. They eventually the Seljuks rose up. At least the Romans invaded in the north, passing through Armenia. The Seljuks were expanding in Syria, so Alparslan marched to the north. But these were areas were in between. There was a freaking mess going on, and autonomous powers, lords, and so on, and all this idea of overlordship. And at the end of the day, you feudalization, because also the Seljuks brought, in part because of the Persian influence, but also because of the general collapse of of the centralized caliphal structures and the Arab society altogether, there's ever more privatistic sense, quasi-feudal, so much that the Crusades, when they met these guys, they kind of also recognized something common in terms of chivalry, or equestrian culture, of certain values, military values, moral values, of honor, all this stuff. So it's fascinating how the Oghuz, how far, that gives how far they arrived after their collapse at migrating. It gives you the migration of how many they were and how impacting they were in a huge surrounding. So this is actually a very overlooked polity that deserves definitely more credit, in that, unfortunately, we know a few about, especially during the acme of their power, right? And consider that the same Seljuks that this historically, as also the Caliphate before had the Abbasids had done, and any other Muslim power in the area fundamentally had always a large part of their military strength supplied by subject Turkoman tribesmen. That is to say, the Seljuks had, as we've seen, also sedentarized on their own, but when they needed fresh troops, also to maintain the, to not to fuel. Not to give too importance to the local elites that were strengthening, territorializing, and eroding their own power as an attemptably at least central one. They continuously hired these tribesmen from the north, either as slaves, either as freemen, whatever, but continuing to essentially to fight with those guys who were, as we've seen, the remnants of their own ancestors, those same that had, for which they had originated, the same story that they had at the end of the day, and perpetuating the thing over and over again with the same people, the same tactics. The Turks, in this, being very specific, having very different armies from, say, the one of the Ayyubids that still, however, hired these remnants of the Oghuz people. But the Egyptians were way more kind of Western in military organization, much more centered on infantry, etc. Instead, the Seljuks being stereotypically also, it very well. We've seen it so many times from the Crusader sources, just cavalry, right? And mostly this, as we've seen, ultra heavy yet narrow elite of cavalrymen, and it swarms this waves, hordes, whatever you want to call them, sea tide of horse archers that were dramatically skilled with hit and run tactics and to coordinate movements. The idea that they were continuously harassing the enemies with this hail of arrows and so on. It also wasn't like it was all the mass all together, but it's not an individually the single horse archer could do more, especially against armored opponents. But still, that was what in the steppe was like, and it still worked in the Middle East, in the Near East, and there would be much more to say. Even think about the impact with the Crusaders, some changes even in the in the Turkic military culture, at least in the region. But I hope that, at least as a picture, we have the idea of who these people, what their experience, what their progressed military culture, and what their interaction with the surroundings actually was. Because, we have to accept the fact that, as for many peoples, historically speaking, in certain times especially, all we know is from other ones, from the sedentary world. Right? If they didn't write, or if they wrote in a very different way, with very different functions and meanings and usage than other peoples. And it's kind of fascinating that the Seljuks also began as tributaries of other peoples detached from the Oghuz, and eventually came to be the overrulers themselves, and inheriting their, in spite of the glorification of their own dynasty specifically, but also the universalistic imperial models of the Oghuz, right? We have just an interesting note from a tactical point of view that tells you what these peoples were about. Speaking of light horsemen, right? The lagers, right, the camps on the battlefield. Fortifications were employed even, from defending the camps traditionally, that were somewhat frustrating for nomadic tribes, because notoriously in the steppe there are very few fortifications. It was also all open ground, completely different strategical and consequently tactical dynamics, right? And there's a recorded instance at the Battle of Tel Afar in 1042, when Oghuz horsemen, having initially beaten an Arab force and pushed it back into their encampment, found themselves severely hampered and unable to use their bows in the confined spaces among the tents and wagons of the Arabs, right? So that they were eventually soundly beaten in the hand-to-hand struggle in there. This is fascinating because we could draw some connections between the same views that naturally the peoples of the steppes made of fortified camps of entrenchments. They did exist. We were talking about before the citadel of Kent itself is properly a fortress, right? But this gives you a good example how the more sedentary and presumably better equipped, better armored and armed Arab infantry in this case, naturally once these lighter horsemen descended from horses back and came at close quarters with them, they were pretty much a disadvantage, right? But at the same time, there are certain military circumstances that you cannot avoid to get yourself into. That is, there's no army that functions just with cavalry. At a certain point, you have to dismount to seize the position you want to defend and to keep, because otherwise you couldn't kill everybody, but not maintaining everything. But in the steppes wasn't very different from that, because the objective was mostly cattle raiding at the end of the day. But as we were saying before, the steppes were not all alike, and so this is also a bit of a kind of a wargamistic abstraction. Of course, they're always a position to hold, sedentarily speaking. They didn't roam around all the time. They had their own fixed places, encampments, so on. But still, there is a great difference between place and place, people and people sometimes. And everybody adapts to the situation as much as as well as they can. However, for now we stop it here. We'll come back talking about the Oghuz at some point, I'm sure. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.